Yes, I'm Jeff DeVries. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. I want to talk a little bit about some of the empirical work I've been doing to try to measure some of these things. I'm kind of the psychologist in the room of philosophers and sociologists, so I'm trying to measure this in an empirical way. I'm very happy to be here. Hang on. There we go. Oh, yes. Okay. So I'm very happy to be here to explore, to share the results from my work over the last 2 years as part of the embedding the development of intellectual character in the university curriculum project with Richard and with Duncan. The work kind of on the empirical side, trying to measure and quantify some of this and hopefully understand what we can do in practice as well. And I'm very pleased to have to present work that I've co-authored here with Gabe Arona and of course Richard Aram as part of this work. So I wanted to start, I know I've got people in the room who are probably much better at defining some of these virtues in a broad sense, but I kind of need to start with a sort of an operational definition. I'm going to treat it as something I'm going to try to measure. And so I kind of thought about what behaviors are really related here to intellectual humility, and we can kind of use that as a starting point. And so there's two core kind of behaviors that I want to start with. And one is sort of an acknowledgement of where I might not know something or where I've made a mistake. So that's one aspect. And we've kind of talked about intellectual openness as a separate virtue. I'm kind of grouping it here because I think part of it, at least in terms of the classroom right now, is going to be to consider other points of view. So we want to talk about it on a philosophical level, whether these are the same or separate. We can have that conversation, but I'm kind of treating that as my definition for now. And I think we've got we've had some other presentations this morning about like why this is important. I think that's very, very critical for development of education. But there are some maybe more concrete positives that past research has identified as associated with intellectual humility. Students who have higher intellectual humility or report they have or engage more intellectually humble behaviors tend to show higher levels of general knowledge. They tend to also be more resistant to misinformation. So misinformation that we might see online concerning certain topics that we don't need to get into as much detail here, but I'm sure you can think of some examples. They tend to engage in more reflective thinking. They tend to be more motivated in the classroom. They're more motivated learners. And relating to that, they tend to persist longer after facing challenges in the classroom. Maybe it's a difficult exam or they got a poorer grade than they thought, but they tend to maintain those higher levels of motivation. So we can say that there are some more concrete gains in the education process. And so, some people might be persuaded by the virtuous goals, which I think are virtuous and important, but there are some more concrete aspects of some of these virtues in the classroom. What I want to talk today is basically about two studies that I have done over the last couple of years relating to intellectual humility in the classroom. And I want to give you a brief picture of what I want to look at in the future. These studies relate to just measuring it in the classroom. So one of the main things we wanted to do is create a survey instrument that we can measure in the classroom in a large scale. And we want to relate intellectual humility in the students to that in the teachers. We kind of want to measure on both sides here because I think we had this mentioned before, but there's a value in modeling these virtues in our students. And so the first study is going to focus very generally on the course area, the subject area, but also a little bit on the course formats. Are there certain types of courses that are more interactive that might sort of help better cultivate intellectual humility? And the second one, we want to look at some more specific teaching behaviors and course materials, so the decisions that teachers are making in the classroom in the education process. So this is the survey instrument that I developed for these studies. Again, I'm focusing on these two basic behaviors. One is acknowledgement of mistakes or where you might not know something. Another is considering other points of view. And I wanted to focus on behaviors because I thought it was really important that we talk about what the students are reporting they're doing and what they're observing their teachers are doing. And they can't really report on what the teacher is thinking when they come up with their lesson plan, but they can report on what those lessons are, what the teacher says, what the teacher does. And so then we have these mirrored instruments where the student is reporting what they're doing and they're reporting what they're seeing their teacher does. Certainly these virtues have an internal dimension as well, but for the sake of this study, we're focusing on these behavioral levels. So in the first study, we had students rate their and their teachers' intellectual humility across 5 different courses. And this is a large survey that is part of the UCI MUST project, larger measurement project, which I'm not going to go into a bunch of detail here, but we have regular measurements, survey measurements of students at the beginning of the quarter, and in many cases, for many students, at the end of each course, or at the end of each quarter, they report on what they've done in the courses. And so we use this to ask students what they're doing, what their teachers are doing in those classrooms. We grouped the courses into 3 different areas that we wanted to focus on. So humanities, this is going to include history, arts, philosophy, social sciences, so psychology, sociology, economics, and then STEM plus M, so STEM, science, technology, engineering, math, but also medicine. And the reason for that is we think that these courses are taught in different ways. Okay, and we also looked at the course types. So we know whether the course included sections that were a lecture, a lab, a discussion, or something else. I'm going to focus on the lecture and lab. And it's important to note that many courses have multiple sections. They might have a lecture and a lab. They might have a discussion and a practicum or something, right? But we're focused on if they have a lecture or not, if they have a lab or not. Okay. I should point out that we had students rate these intellectual behaviors on how frequently they happened on a scale of 1 to 5. So it's a Likert scale. 5 was every week. 1 was never. On average, students said 3.5, which it's in my notes that I don't see right now, but if I remember correctly, that is between once every 2 weeks and once every month, which means, it's not that often, but it is happening. They are reporting these behaviors. So if we have a 3-month quarter, then maybe it's 3 times in the term. For a single class, maybe it's 6 times on average. There, of course, can be variation. One of our key findings, though, is that teacher intellectual humility strongly correlates with that of the students. So if the student sees the teacher engaging in his intellectual humble behaviors, they're more likely to report that they are engaging in those behaviors too. The covariance there is 0.5. We built this in a larger regression model. I'm just showing you that specific value there, but that's actually quite high and a very strong effect. Then we also looked at, do they vary across these different course areas? And we found some interesting stuff there. So again, 3 was once every 2 weeks, and 4, once every month, and 4 is once every 2 weeks. So all of these are in that range. And what we did see is that, by the way, instructor's always gonna be on the left from now on, and students always gonna be on the right. I'm gonna present both sides. Instructor intellectual humility in humanities was rated much higher than the other ones. There wasn't much difference between STEM and social sciences. But student intellectual humility was reported actually quite high in STEM, in fact, higher than in humanities. So even though there's a strong relationship between instructor and student intellectual humility, it does vary by the classroom quite a lot, and it varies by the course area. So why is it higher in STEM? Well, we think it's because we also see this variation in lectures and labs. So here's lectures, and in lectures, if there's not a lecture section, they report higher intellectual humility for themselves and for their teachers. But for labs, student intellectual humility is higher in courses that include a lab section. Not much difference as far as the instructor. So what do we see in STEM courses? We see a lot of courses that include a lab section. So why do labs help? Well, We think it's because a lab section is an interactive course format, right? So the students are engaged in more of this trial and error learning. Not to put too fine of a point on it, but if you make a mistake, you can admit that you make a mistake. If you don't think you ever made a mistake, because all you do is you go to lectures, and you took the test, and you're like, yeah, I got a B, whatever. That's not the same experience. That doesn't necessarily mean that they're more humble, but they're engaged in more of those behaviors, right? And so that's what we think is going on there. Well, what can the teacher do in the classroom? So that's one thing that we can do, is we talk about the course format and the shape of the course, but what about the actual classroom? So we looked at some common behaviors, core behaviors in the pedagogical experience, feedback, and also expectations. These are interrelated aspects of teaching and learning. But we also looked at some common materials that are really common across almost all courses. We had the option to look at some more materials. We had some data on them, but we didn't really look at them because almost all courses include exams. Almost all courses include readings. Students might not do the readings, but they are part of the course. So focusing on these behaviors, we did limit it a little bit. So if you look at the 5 classes, we looked only at what students thought their most important class last quarter was and what they thought the most difficult course was. And this included some extra data from some additional quarters that we grouped together. So here we have intellectual humility. Again, this is the 1 to 5 rating. In this case, feedback was scaled from 1, never, 100 all the time. How often did the students, how often did the instructor give helpful feedback to the students? And we see consistent effects across instructor, again, on the left, and student on the right. Students perceive their instructors as having higher intellectual humility, but they also report it higher in themselves when the instructors are giving consistent, frequent, helpful feedback. And that's across, again, as you can see, both the difficult and important courses. Expectations was a slightly different story. We didn't really see a relationship between instructor intellectual humility and high teaching expectations. And this was worded in the phrase of, I think it's down there. You might not be able to see it with the Zoom icon there, but this was, how does the instructor have high expectations for students similar to myself? And if the student said yes, very high expectations at 100, they actually rated themselves as having higher intellectual humility. Now, that could be a number of forms, that could take a number of forms in the classroom, but one idea here is that they're being challenged more often in the classroom. They're facing those difficulties more often. But those difficulties alone maybe aren't enough. Talk about that in a second. Here we have students who rated the usefulness of the reading assignments. So this is how useful were the reading assignments for my learning. And we have instructor on the left and teacher on the right. These results are a little more mixed. This is the reading assignments. We did see that if the student thought the teacher had given them useful reading assignments, they rate the teacher as higher intellectual humility. Doesn't seem to affect their own intellectual humility. One possibility here, again, as I mentioned before, students might not really be doing a lot of the reading. There's a lot of research that shows they don't do the reading in college courses much of the time. So those that do, it's sort of a self-selection effect. They may be more sensitive to aspects of intellectual humility in their instructor. But exams, so if they thought that the exams were useful for their learning, we see a clear consistent effect, again, in difficult and important courses, higher teacher intellectual humility, higher student intellectual humility. Now, what might those exams look like? Well, again, we have this survey question, but our idea here is that formative assessments, so assessments that are useful, designed to be useful for learning, show this relationship. Whereas exams that are just summative, well, the students aren't getting the same response in that case. Okay. So just to reiterate, just to state this again, we really do see these consistent effects. And it is consistent across the difficult and important courses. So we think that, it's going to be generally significant across most of their courses. So student intellectual humility related to the expectations and the feedback from their instructors, and also if they thought that the exams were useful for learning. Instructor intellectual humility, again related to feedback, but in this case, the course materials were very important, whereas the expectations were not. So what does this mean for our practice? Taking all of this together, well, these interactive courses, not just talking to the students, but an interaction. When you do interact, providing challenges, but also feedback, consistent feedback, are really helpful for the development of intellectual humility, or at least correlated to. Maybe I'm being too strong when I say it's helpful for the development of it, but they relate to intellectually humble behaviors. As does the intellectual humble behaviors of the teacher, so modeling the behavior is very important. Yeah, so those are some of the broad conclusions here, but what do we want to go from here? So we've built these scales and done this large scale measurement of intellectual humility. Well, I want to expand this to other virtues. We talked about some of them this morning, but I really want to expand this. We want to talk about intellectual integrity. We're going to talk about tenacity and academic curiosity. And then if we can do similar sorts of measurements in individual classrooms, see how they vary from one classroom to the next within the students, across different classrooms, between different students, this will help us build a better understanding of this process in the classroom. And we can incorporate those into large-scale studies. So, we can use the framework of UCI Must, for instance, and we can understand this at the micro level, the classroom level. Maybe that's not micro enough for some people, but for me in these large-scale studies, micro level and the classroom level, but macro level throughout the entire university experience. And we can take that and look at these longitudinal effects. So if our goal in the university is to cultivate these virtues, are we doing that? Does it increase over the 4 years of university attendance? Does developing these virtues across university relate to what happens after you leave university? It's going to help you have a better life, a happier life, help you get a better career. We'd like to think it will, but these are important things that we want to measure. We also have, because this is integrated in the UCI Must program, we also have the ability to look at this in a very different educational context. So there is the UC Lifted program where we have bachelor students who are incarcerated. They are in prison. And we are working on measuring these virtues also in that very different but very important educational context. We can help understand if prison education also can connect to these virtues. So I do have a few references, but I won't dwell on those. Come ask me for the slides, or I'll share them with you if you want to take a picture later. But I want to say thank you, and I'm happy to take questions or comments. I should say thank you again for our funding from Templeton Grant Foundation. And yeah, if you guys have any questions, or if you want to look at the papers, I'll leave that up there. Thank you.
Right, thank you so much. Questions, and if there are, I will move this microphone around because I think it's needed for the Zoom people.
Hi, thank you so much. I would like to bring you into nursing also. I'm probably thinking our dean is thinking the same thing. So I have a question about the faculty. Do you have any idea which faculty members the students were in class with? And not because I want to point them out or anything, although I'm curious. More because I'm curious about their training in the virtues, because Cassidy and I were just talking about bringing the virtues trainings to our faculty in the School of Nursing because of this modeling behavior, and how that might be a way to bring that and enculturate it more in our student population, is to really make it more versed and more kind of ingrained within our faculty as well.
Yeah, so we do to a point, but we don't always have good data. It's kind of, it's a large scale survey across the entire university population. So, it might only be, we might only have 3 students within one particular teacher. But we did actually cluster the data with the assumption that, you know, that faculty member would have a similar value across their courses. They may not, and we allowed for that possibility, but we assume that they might. So we kind of group the data at the student level, but also at the teacher level to kind of account for that question. We can possibly determine, you know, with an anonymous ID, what you know, which faculty is, you know, and we can look and see what school they're in. We haven't done that yet, but it's a possibility, and it would be very interesting to follow specific teachers, because then you can do sort of a quasi-experiment. Right. Teachers who did the training versus teachers who didn't, teaching the same course. That would be extremely interesting and really complement some of this work.
I'm thinking if we really want to enculturate it in the school, the best way to do that is to enculturate it in everyone here. Just, you know.
Especially if modeling it is so important.
Exactly.
Yeah, I was also curious as to if there was any measure or any look at the social environment that students were in, whether, you know, friends or family, if they observed the virtues, the amount of observed virtues in their lives elsewhere.
So that would be a very interesting study. We didn't look at that. We have some idea a little bit about the student background from administrative records, so gender, ethnicity, and things like that. You know, income status, but we don't know like within their social connection. So that would be a different study that would be very interesting to look at, not just in academics. Do we see, you know, other sources from family, from other social networks, let's say, other social support networks? That would be super interesting.
So as you might guess now, I'm kind of suspicious about self-reports. I think this is very interesting, but I guess I'm wondering if some of these findings could have other explanations. So for example, exams, like, could it be that it's not actually about usefulness of exams, but students that find exams useful tend to have more intellectual humility? Yeah, it's quite possible we have the opposite reaction, that people who have high intellectual humility are reporting these are just correlations. We obviously need experimental follow-ups with some of these things, but it is well grounded in, you know, what we expect. Formative assessment is expected to be associated with intellectual humility, for instance. And it's funny you say that, because I am working on another project where we ask students about their AI usage. I'm trying to relate it to the same survey, and results have been a little bit messy, I'll just say. So it's possible, especially your results where you're asking students in the same survey about self-rate their own. One way I think we're a little bit distanced from that is this is after the course, it's anonymized, and we're not asking them rate your intellectual humility. We're saying, did you do this behavior? Did you see this behavior? So I think there is a tendency to rate yourselves higher if you're asked, are you virtuous? But that's one of the reasons we also wanted to focus on these behaviors as opposed to asking them, are you a humble person? Which I think is a problematic question for a lot of reasons.
Any more questions?
Thank you for this, really interesting. I'm thinking a lot about the question around labs and how in medicine, you know, there's a aspect of the lab where in the humanities there's not.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking about that a lot in terms of like, what is the field of philosophy? Like, what does field work look like in philosophy or in other humanities? And it's, you know, I mean, I don't want to speak for anybody, but, you know, it's at some level, like, when I took an intro to poli-sci, the first day of class, they said, you need to get into the field and work with a nonprofit or work with a civil organization, and just, you know, and observe, you need to write about it. But in philosophy, I've never been asked to do that. And so I guess, like, you know, maybe public philosophy is sort of the field of, you know, but I wonder, kind of relating to the other talks we've had today, like, you know, is like a charitable reconstruction field work, you know, where you sort of join a space or you're in a place where your job is just to listen, you know, like to really understand, to unpack ideas versus come in with a, you know, an argument about how to do something. I don't know, I'm just curious, like, I don't know if the research really focuses on that, but you mentioned sort of interactive course formats, but I just wonder if we should be thinking about ways to have students in the field, outside of the classroom, not just testing their ideas, but like getting real public feedback outside of presenting a paper or presenting to other like-minded people in the field who know this stuff and are going to give you really, I don't know.
Yeah, it's difficult, right? So we call my presentation kind of makes social sciences look bad because we are the lowest, the social sciences, and I'm a social scientist. But again, imagine what the course format is of most social science courses. There's no lab, there's going to be a lecture 3 days a week. And then there's an exam, 3 to 5 times, and that's it, right? Maybe you write a paper. There's some variation, and once you get past lower level courses, you get more interactive discussion, you get smaller groups, you might do a class that is just a discussion or a seminar where you're reading papers, you're talking to people about it. But most of this data does come from these first and second year students, and most of these social science courses are going to be these large format ones. So it's not that you can't do interactive instruction at that level, it's just it doesn't usually happen. And so that's one reason we've tried to move with the second study. Well, what are the teachers actually doing? And we'll kind of decouple it from the format. I think it's harder because the format guides what you do, right? In these large courses. It's harder to do those things, but if you can do those things, I think they're valuable. And I think the same thing, like doing something different that's project-based learning or active learning or something like that, I think that is something that will that is going to improve intellectual humility, or at least be related to higher intellectual humility. But it's hard to do that, but we should still do it.
All right, we are out of time, so thank you so much, Jeff, and thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you so much.